start off today with a quick poll on what LTI tools you all are using today, or if you are using them, etc. Now, I'm not talking about resource apps like Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive. I'm not talking about the SIS apps like a Skyward app or something like that. We're talking about LTI apps, content that you're dynamically pulling into Schoology. So you should see that poll pop up on your screen now. And I'll give that a minute here. We got some nice and interesting answers this morning. In the morning crew, a lot of people were doing this kind of thing. And similarly, we had a fair amount of people who were maybe not sure what the nature of that content was. And one thing that we hope to do today is to demystify some of that content. Cool. So let me share those results with you. And we see about half of you are definitely doing this, but a good chunk of you aren't, and some of you not sure. So I think hopefully today you're going to leave with some interesting ideas. Kelly, you know, this whole conversation centers around the idea of content, the content that you're purchasing anyway. A lot of that is digital content. Sometimes it's for iPads. Sometimes it's a paper textbook that might have a digital supplement. But there are certainly so many new tools, very cool tools out there that have just really great courseware. Sometimes it's flat courseware and just instructional content, and sometimes it is actually interactive, and there might be assessments. So let's just do one other poll that asks, are you actually vetting new publisher content this summer? Because if you are, I hope all of this content that we're providing you today is going to be really valuable and interesting. Our main goal is not necessarily to educate you on all of the apps that we integrate with, but give you a sense of what those integrations look like to help you have a better conversation and a more in-depth conversation with your vendors. And I'll go ahead and close that and share the results with you. Great. So about 50% of you are or might be looking at content, okay? So this is all excellent information. Even if you are not looking at content, I think this is great information to take with you, because it might spark some ideas. We'll see. Okay, you should see my screen again. What is LTI? Kelly, how do you approach this? Just explaining what LTI is. I mean, the education industry is a little bit overpacked with acronyms.
Mm-hmm. I guess I've described it mostly. I mean, the letters stand for Learning Tool Interoperability, which is a mouthful. And how I've described it before is that it's something that allows systems to talk together, and in a kind of a way that's supposed to be standard. But Bradley, as you know, we have a colleague at Schoology who talks about LTI being the standard that nobody follows. Was that his comment?
It was something like that, that nobody follows or everyone follows differently.
Everyone follows differently, yes. So anyway, it's supposed to let systems talk to each other so that you can use different learning tools together and really get the best of both.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I'm thinking about this in a new way, that the standard has a lot to do with the data that's passed back and forth, but not necessarily how the tool is designed or what the tool actually does, what its actual function is. It has more to do with just that raw data that's being passed back and forth and how vendors can talk to each other with those pieces of data. So if we look at this little infographic, when you have a tool like this, often it's being popped inside of the LMS. When a student opens that tool, they are getting single sign-on into that application. So that application is actually existing on another server, but it's opening inside of your Schoology window, and we'll see examples of that. Sometimes it pops out into a new window too, depending on the application. But it should sign you on right to that application, so your faculty members and your students are not having to keep track of a bazillion passwords. Okay, so you got the single sign-on piece. And when you're signed in, that content displays inside of Schoology. Now, there are various versions of LTI, and those different versions support different kinds of features. For instance, content that actually has assessmentware in it, some of that will allow you to pull grades actually into the Schoology gradebook. So you take a quiz out in some other site that's embedded in Schoology, and those quiz results could actually go into the Schoology gradebook. Okay. Now, each of these tools works a little bit differently. So, and let's take a look at them. But before we take I'm just going to, I want to talk about the installation piece, but let me just show you an example really quick for those of you who are not using LTI tools. Okay. You see this icon in my upcoming feed. These are all different kinds of LTI tools. Of course, we'll see that in my course folder view as well. And if we click into this, this is a piece of content from BrainPop. We see that it's opening right inside of Schoology, and you see my username up here. It's automatically signed me in. And I can do all of these different activities as a student, or I can curate these activities as an instructor for the students. So this is just an example of what it looks like if you haven't seen an LTI tool before. Really nice consolidation of all of your resources here. Kelly, let's look at how these are set up. I'm going to frame these in two buckets. A manual setup area that's existed in Schoology for a long time, and the continued enhancements we've been adding to the Schoology App Center that does some stuff for you. So if you're doing this on your own with a piece of content, the old school way I'm going to call it, system settings, and there's an integration tab. This is often where you're setting up single sign-on and your custom domain, things like that when you first start with Schoology. But the last tab here is the external tools, and this is where you would actually add a provider. So this is where I would actually put in credentials, for example, BrainPop. And those are credentials that basically my sales rep or support rep at BrainPop would have given me to pop into Schoology. But you'll see that this form here where you enter that, it's there's a lot of steps here, and you have to make sure to get all these right. And the vendor usually walks you through this. Schoology, we only know so much about how a vendor requires their application to be set up. So you're always going to want to go to the vendor for this kind of information. Now there is also an easier way to do this. This is a screenshot from the App Center. Let me pop over there real quick. So many of you are familiar with the App Center. This is where you're seeing your Google Drive and SIS apps too and things like that. But a lot of these other apps are also they're actually LTI apps. You don't necessarily see that word everywhere, but that's what they are. And for instance, when you click into something, they give you, some give you a public consumer key and secret, and if they're free. And often those consumer key and secrets, those are actually what is given to you from the vendor if it's a purchased application. And you see here, install LTI app. So let's look at the installation process from this direction. And go back to my other view here. There we go. When you click that button, you're going to be asked if you want to install something to your organization or just for you. In most cases, everyone on this call, you're going to be installing something for your organization. Then you get a list of your apps. You have to configure them first. There are those fields for consumer key and shared secret. Again, you're getting those either from the vendor, if it's a paid app. Usually free apps just list the credentials in the App Center itself. Like for instance, that Quizlet app, the consumer key is Schoology and the secret is LTI. And then after you configure it, even though you've added it, it's actually not installed anywhere yet. It's just set up in your system. Then you're going to actually install it either for users or courses or groups. Now, what is available in this screen is usually set or is explicitly set by the application itself. And most LTI apps, you'll only see the courses option here because most LTI apps are for the course. Where you see apps that have a lot of different areas, sometimes those are for ebooks and things like that. And after you get that done, then they're available in a number of places. So that's the installation piece. The trick is once it's installed, where does it go? Many of you may have stumbled on some of these options as you've learned Schoology or played around with courses and wondered what they are. When we're talking about LTI apps, what we're really talking about is, let's go into our course here. Some of you have seen this option and wondered, okay, pretty basic what a file and a link are, but what in the world is an external tool? When we click this, there we see that a similar form field, and if we have set up LTI apps, some will be listed here. And then this field gets filled up by itself, okay? And then you're basically adding this content into your course. Now this is just one area. Let's pause here. I'm just going to take a quick look at the questions just about setup, because now I want to go on the grand tour of all the places you can install LTI apps. Because as we said earlier, Kelly, I think the key is that LTI is about data and basically data points that an LMS and a content provider are sharing. But what the tool is, what the actual interface is, what the even purpose of the thing is, are wildly different, and therefore might be installed in totally different places in Schoology depending on what their purpose is. And that may be where things get confusing. So any questions we need to address so far, Kelly?
We had a couple of questions about, Ariel asked about how do you distinguish between API and LTI when you're explaining things to someone who's a novice? And I guess it would depend on who was asking. If it was someone in a teacher role, I think maybe you just explain those things help things connect. They just do it in different ways. Because I'm not sure you need to get into the weeds. If it's someone more technical, they probably understand that there's something that lives in the software side of things that actually is built into a software package in terms of connectivity, and that's very software dependent. LTI being more of a standard is a little bit more global, hence IMS Global.
That's right. That's a pretty good way of putting it. LTI is a standard, and it's a pretty compact standard having to do with authentication, sending back and forth emails and usernames to keep track of users on both systems, and certain like enrollments, your licenses for those systems. Those keys, the consumer key and the secret, those are the things that are controlling those licenses. And then possibly the passing back and forth of the activity data. Jill Smith did something over here and she got a score. Let's send it to the LMS. And it's pretty strictly there. Once you start talking about the API, often you're talking to developers who don't want to be limited by any of this. That the authentication is just the beginning. They want to do something more like go to developers.schoology.com and, for instance, build out an entire app that can, for instance, get into any part of Schoology, whether it be course materials or grade interactions or the ability to actually dynamically create content within Schoology. APIs in any technology platform are wildly powerful and far outside the scope of this presentation, but they are very exciting. Often we hear about APIs when an organization actually wants to build a full kind of feature that works in Schoology, like for instance like an enrollment function or a course directory function. They might use a Schoology API to build out a whole new application that works with Schoology. Where LTI is very specifically about how targeted to how do LMSs interact with content providers. They just really zoning in on bridging that gap. And as Kelly said, the organization IMS Global are the ones who govern that standard and push that standard forward, and that we work with to make sure that we're adhering to the standard and our vendors are adhering to the standard. Does that help?
Yeah, I think the other question we got was about grade passback, specifically things like brain pop. And I think, you know, as Bradley mentioned, there are many tools that will interact. Some of them have a more in-depth interaction with Schoology than others. Some will provide grade passback, and some simply serve as a way to access the content almost in a consumable way. That's
right. So I think that's a pretty good segue. Let's look at some of those scenarios, and we're going to do two things. We're going to look at different examples of where these tools show up in Schoology, because what I just showed you from Add Materials, that's just one spot, and that's probably the oldest spot that we've had, but there are a lot of new spots too. And then depending on what kind of tool it is, how are they interacting? Is it just content? Is this just something signing us into the platform, or a way for us to get their content, or are we doing something much deeper like sending grades? So without further ado, let's dig into that. Okay, I started off by showing this basic example that has been in Schoology a long time. It's, I'm going to say it's not the prettiest example. It's the oldest way we've been able to bring in LTI content is by having tools already set up by an admin and then adding external tool. And it's combined with that, the link feature, because you really, that's kind of what you're doing. You're linking out to content, but the content is instead displaying inside of Schoology. You will also see that example at the bottom of assignments. Some tools you can, instead of adding it as a material itself, you could attach it to something else, possibly. Okay? Just like you would attach a link to an assignment or a handout. In this case, you may be giving assignment instructions and saying, hey, do this thing, do this work that I've attached here. Okay? Let's just look at an example of this really quick. So we have a lesson here, and here is something that we added through Brain Pop. I'm just going to edit this first. Let me show you where it is. So just like what we were looking at, I've selected a tool provider that my system admin had already set up for me. It filled all this out for me. I added a title. This custom parameters area, you almost never have to deal with that. If someone wants to know more about that, let me know in chat, but you usually don't have to look at that.
And something else we talked about this morning, Bradley, was kind of a good idea of having almost like a naming convention when you add these external tools, because the icon looks the same. So to a student, they won't know that it's Brain Pop versus CK12 versus something else. So you can use that title area to give something a little more descriptive that helps a student either know what they're supposed to do or what the tool actually is. If you really want to give directions, like Bradley said, an assignment actually can work really well for that, because you can wrap the content into what you want them to do and assign standards, individually assign, all that good stuff.
That's right. So it does very much depend on what the purpose is. I will tell you, if you start experimenting with this, there are some tools that will work right away here. And if you attach something to the bottom, using that same icon, to the bottom of an assignment, most work, but some LTI tools were not necessarily meant to be used in that area. So if you attach something to an assignment and it isn't working, don't be surprised. It may not be broken. Contact the vendor and ask them if they intended it to work there, because they may not have intended it to work there, and that's just just a training opportunity at that point. Okay, and what's new, so those of you who have been with Schoology for a long time, those two options are probably pretty familiar with you. What is new is that now vendors have a few more opportunities to actually add things to display right as other material options. And this is pretty cool because you're bringing a lot of visibility into these tools, especially if these are purchase apps, or even if you spent a lot of PD time trying to educate your staff on using different kinds of digital content. This is a great way to just add visibility and a visual reminder that this content is there for you. We see that both from the Add Materials area, which we'll look at, but you will also sometimes see that in the Rich Text Editor from the Insert Content menu. You'll also see a new column there with LTI apps if they were built to work within the Rich Text Editor. Let's take a look at those two scenarios. Okay, so clicking the green dotted line, and we see our CK12 app, we see Quizlet, we see TED-Ed here. I'm going to go with CK12. And what's cool about a lot of these apps, now you're seeing me add something from scratch, that as the course administrator or teacher or faculty member, you are first greeted with a search area with many of these content content providers work like this. This is similar with Atomic Learning, similar with Quizlet, similar with many of the tools. Drill down into the content. And here we go. I can simply grab this video or grab this assessment. I'm going to grab the video for now. And it has been added to my course. Here it is. And notice that as we were talking about titles, when I did that, it automatically set the title for me. I could actually go back in and change this if I wanted to from the gear icon. And okay, the staff had a prompt to search for something, but if I jump over to another browser here where I have my student loaded in the same course, let me make sure this is refreshed, and click that item, notice what happens for the student. There's no search. They are immediately served up that content. So they don't have to go out to the site. They don't have to find anything. They don't have to follow a link, copy and paste anything. That content is served up to them immediately. Okay. So are you with me so far? This is a good place to start. I'm just looking at chat here. Okay, so that was added something directly. One thing that is lacking here a little bit is that concept that Kelly said, well, what if we want to add due dates on this? What if we want to add some other context? For instance, if I just add it here, I'm having to verbally say, hey, so everyone go into this folder, click this thing, da-da-da-da, and I may want to provide more context. So let's look at another way that we're allowed to add content. Instead, I could, let's say I'm adding a discussion. And instead, I can insert content here. I could go into Quizlet, TED-Ed, I could go into many of these, the math editor, and add content in this way. And here's a piece of content, and I can check it out, I can play it, I can go through all of this stuff, and then embed the content. So for instance, let's say that I am going to be out, I have a sub. Well, I can actually set all this stuff up for the substitute, give my students instructions that the sub can also see here, and everything is already set up. I've told them that I want them to pair up and use these study guides and then post in the discussion board what they felt were the hardest questions, and then that could build into a completely different kind of lesson in the discussion board, prompted by that really interesting embedded content that was provided to me right here. Now, I certainly will have colleagues that say, you know, well, we should just go out to Quizlet and get the embed code. That's actually a lot of steps. There are a lot of places to click on. You have to be signed in already. With this app, if you've done a little session on Quizlet, all they have to remember to do is go to insert content. So you're getting that content to them a little bit quicker. Yes, there are certainly other ways to do it, and I might be one of those people who goes right to the site, but this is a really nice, well-packaged way to just pop something into your other Schoology materials. And now I can actually you know, assign a due date to it and things like that. And I'll pop that open so we can see the result. There we are, and there's the Quizlet app. Okay, let's pop back to our slides for a second. So those are a couple of options. There are two other places where you'll see apps, and those familiar with the App Center, you're probably familiar with the apps that will install just in that left-hand menu there. You'll see the McGraw-Hill app and the Microsoft OneNote Class Notebook app installed on the left-hand side. You will often see vendors building apps like this when they are not just a small activity, but a full-blown application. For instance, this McGraw-Hill option opens up their entire Connect Ed site. And it opens in a new window because there's a whole network here. But notice it does the one thing that I need it to do, which is single sign-on. So all of my students are immediately in there. I don't have to worry about distributing all of those usernames and codes and all that stuff. And many of these apps will also, if a user doesn't already exist in that platform, will dynamically create the user upon first access, which is also very cool. And others in the App Store, not all of them open up in their own window. Some of them do open up right inside of Schoology, depending on what you're doing. Okay. Now, I'm going to say that that's the end of the tour. Where are all the LTI apps existing? Kelly, shall we dive into a couple and actually look at the difference between the apps and the kind of functionality they support?
Yeah, it would be good, especially with something like the ones you have here that really are a good way to build in some pretty cool dynamic content, but keep the kids actually still in Schoology. So, as Bradley mentioned, we can actually just put in links, as some of these kind of work like links, but having everything embedded just kind of keeps everything in one spot instead of sending kids off into different windows, different frames, and different places they may have to log in.
Right. So let's go back and look at CK12 here. It's opening up right inside the window. If we go into the student view, it'll be the same thing. So this is an example of one of the CK12 pieces of content that has a lot of videos. This is basically like a digital textbook with a lot of rich content in it. You may be teaching directly from this kind of curriculum. Right now, there is no interaction here besides viewing it, besides opening it. Let's edit this. Let's take a look at this, because even though it is just viewable and I just have the LTI, all this stuff was automatically set for me. The tool does all that for you. You would never have to actually insert this stuff. But what I did do manually is I came down here and I did something interesting. I enabled grading. What that did, just within the tool, without using an assignment or anything, it added that box that we see at the bottom of assignments where we set points and due dates, grading categories, scales, all of that stuff. And let me show you what happens here. This is the exterior angles theorems from CK12. And again, this is just flat content, but I've been able to add all of this stuff. So as you probably surmise, it did add this to the calendar so that now it's showing my students' activity feed. And I have a student that has already gone through it, so let's look what happens since we enabled grading. Ulysses, who already accessed this, has 100 points marked. Okay. The rest of my students have not touched it yet. So just access alone has created a binary grade in my grade book. 100% they completed it, 0 if they didn't. If any of you are familiar with SCORM technology, this is really similar to how SCORM works, giving a complete or incomplete or a satisfactory and unsatisfactory status to content. Okay? The vendor themselves are deciding that that is what is being sent back to the gradebook. Upon access, it's being sent back. Now, this is, I set this to a specific scale. That was basically a completion scale, where 100% was complete and anything below 100% was not. If we look at Ulysses's grade report, exterior angles and theorems, I made the label in that scale say viewed, so I can just quickly go through this and the students can also see it, who's viewed and who has not viewed the content. Okay. So I really like that. Now that was really flat, everything was combined in one. Let's go a little bit deeper and look at atomic learning. Again, atomic learning, not that dissimilar. This is where you, if you're not familiar with it, lots of great playlists for all sorts of content. This is something on JavaScript. Okay, and there's a playlist that I put together. The full app for the instructor is here, so I could modify this playlist, update it, etc. Or play it, preview these.
Okay, so welcome.
All right. If we look at my student here, goes into the JavaScript Atomic Learning, he sees the playlist, and notice this is what we looked at this morning. He has green check marks next to all of these videos, which means he completed the whole thing. Okay, so this is also set to be graded. But because there are multiple parts of this atomic learning lesson, it's not just one big page with some YouTube videos, because it's a full playlist and each video has its own status, this will actually not be marked complete in the Schoology gradebook until all the videos have been accessed. Okay, so if we look at the grade report here, JavaScript Atomic Learning also got 100 out of 100. I could have used the same scale here. We're just seeing, I'm going to show you what points are actually there. But he's going to have actually 0 out of 100 until he clicks on all of those videos. All right? So the data being passed back, the sort of LTI tool being used, is really the same. It's just that the content inside of it and how it's being tracked by the vendor is a bit different because now we have a playlist. There are modules inside of this. All right. Now, Kelly, the next thing I want to show is something that isn't binary, that actually gives a score. But anything we should stop for right now?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Okay. I'm going to say, everybody, hold on to your hats here, because this is where it gets interesting. Let's go back to CK12. CK12 also has assessments. The first thing I brought in and showed you was just a video or just pretty flat content. This is an example of a full assessment piece. And again, this has already been added, But when we first added it, it's the exact same thing we looked at beforehand. I was prompted to go search for some content and pop it in to my course. Okay, I'm in the teacher view right now. Let's pop over to the student view. If you're not familiar with these assessments, this is not necessarily that different than sites like Khan Academy and other practice sites where you are encouraged to get 10 or more correct, and try to go on streaks to get as many correct in a row as possible, but you can always keep practicing. These are very cool adaptive assessments, so the questions do get easier or harder depending on how you are doing. It's very cool. I'm going to keep practicing here and click this button. And now I have this very rich, very interactive assessment. Now we're not just dealing with flat content. This is getting into some pretty cool stuff, telling me that I'm correct. I can enter in anything here. And it'll also tell me when I get things wrong. Right? And notice that it's tracking my progress in here as well. And this will also give me hints to help me along the way if I'm starting to get many of them wrong. Now notice there's a submit button. Let's go ahead and press that. And this is here's where it gets cool. Down here, turn in your score. Now it says turn in again for me because I did this a little bit earlier today, but I can turn this in again. I have 100%. I'll show you an example where I did not get 100% as well. There it goes. And if I go into my grade report, there is my score. But here is another CK12 assessment, linear equation practice. And notice that I only have 30% here. If I open this up to continue practicing it, and interacted with it again, I could, here's my 30% in the tool itself, so the Schoology gradebook and CK12 talking to each other really well. I could now keep practicing and try to up my score here. But since I'm not going to actually read this in front of you, I'm just going to continue getting it wrong. And you all can, judge me as you might. But, I told you in the beginning, be easy on me. This is tricky stuff, just so be easy on me. But again, I can submit this score back into Schoology. What gets very cool with the ability to practice something and continue to submit those scores into Schoology is that as a teacher, let's pop back to the teacher, Ruby here, Ruby Ashley. Click in the gradebook. And there is Ulysses' 30%, but he's interacted with us a few times. If any of you in the fall went on, participated in the Everything You Wanted to Know About Schoology Gradebook Leap Edition, we learned that we can click those three dots as menus there and track revisions. Check this out. Let's look at Ulysses' history. We have a full revision history there, which is pretty cool. So anytime the grade changes, I'm going to get a new grade date and time stamp here for him. So I can actually see if someone's practicing and if their score is improving if I want to drill into this. Even if this is something like something a little more flat, I could still go into track revisions knowing that it's always going to be 0 and 100%, but I can still see that someone kept coming back to the content and viewing it. I can kind of get an idea of how much this content is being viewed and if the student is really studying, especially if it's a struggling student. I can see if they're coming back to the content or if they're not coming to the content at all. So because Schoology provides that depth of information, it provides some really interesting tools. Mm-hmm. Shall we get a little more complicated, everybody? And thank you, Ariel. You know, I'm getting some really good feedback here. The answer is always C. I knew I went for the wrong answer there. You are correct. Next time, Ariel. Next time. I should have taken that advice from you. This is what I get for not monitoring the chat close enough. Okay, so here is that assessment. Now, what can get really interesting, everybody, is let's put our Schoology brains on. Stop thinking about this content. What else can we do in Schoology? As students are accessing these, sometimes they're just viewing it, and sometimes we're collecting scores. This leads me to wonder what we can do with student completion rules. If we have the ability to bring in pre-made adaptive assessments through content like CK12 and other vendors out there, well, you know, here's a big feature request. Well, you know, I want student completion rules. I bet I'm quoting some of you. I want student completion rules where if they take a Schoology test, if they don't pass it, they have to do X instead of Y, right? So this is some sort of adaptive thing. Well, instead, what if we're using an adaptive assessment, published assessment piece, and instead of just being able to view the item before going forward, I could have them actually score out of that adaptive assessment. So instead of Ulysses getting that 30%, he's not going to be able to go forward until he keeps practicing that and masters that content. Kelly, isn't that what we always want to talk about? That mastery is not mastery without practice.
Yes. And I think this is amazing. Like, I'm very geeked out by this. I just want to tell you.
So let's say, you know, you can't do the discussion or you can't do the actual summative Schoology quiz until you've done the practice. Let's say you're using even the Schoology AMP product for district-wide summative exams. Well, right before that Schoology AMP assessment, you pop in the CK12 adaptive assessment so students have the opportunity to practice and master something before they have that high-stakes exam in Schoology. So that gets pretty interesting. And then while students are going through all of this content, you could actually go in and see what their progress is, okay? And see if they've passed that LTI tool or not before they get into those deeper assessment pieces. So I'm just very excited about all of that. Okay, so we've been geeking out. We got into the weeds. Kelly, let's pull back. This morning, we had this great conversation with our friend Jason from CSU Global. That's Colorado State University, their global campus. It's an all virtual campus that they run. It's big time, you know, Schoology is the center of that organization, but they do need to bring in a lot of content, textbooks, things like that from vendors into that global campus. So this whole conversation, we want this to empower you to be able to talk to vendors and talk about why that is important and understand the technology to better inform those conversations. So what we're going to do now is rewind time a little bit and play for you the short conversation we had with Jason. This is about a 7-minute conversation we had literally this morning that we recorded to play back to you, and I'm going to be monitoring chat.
Well, thank you, Bradley. That is, yeah, a really common conversation that I have almost weekly at this point is we'll be looking at different tools for different classes, and they'll say, sure, we have an LTI integration, and then they'll say, what LMS do you use? And for me, that instantly actually sets off some red flags because, as you mentioned prior, the LTI sort of standard, it doesn't really matter what LMS you're using, it should just work. And so for me, that starts that conversation in my head of, well, why are you asking that question? What information is the vendor trying to get out of us that sort of helps them? And sometimes it's simply that they just don't know. A lot of people will say we have an LTI integration sort of because it's expected in the industry, as you said, the single sign-on, the ease of workflow there. That's just sort of something that we're all expecting at this point. So they've added it, but they don't necessarily know how to have that conversation around it. So
Okay.
it almost switches back to you as the person that's after that content to be able to say, well, no, it's LTI. It should work with Schoology. There's no reason it shouldn't.
Right.
So, supply me with a key, a secret, a URL, and let's see where we go from there.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm this is a conjecture, but is it possible that since all the vendors have very different kinds of tools, that they are also, they're in their own silo of their own business. So, of all those different ways I showed that LTI can be added, maybe there's just some product education that those vendors might seek from you as well, and understanding what really the learner's needs are and the instructor's needs are with regard to their tool. I mean, I'm sure you've seen tools that maybe did work, but didn't work really exactly the way you wanted them to.
Yeah, no, that's and to be honest, that's sort of the theme of the technology, and that LTI is great and it's wonderful, and it's I wouldn't call it the future, I'd call it the now. It's sort of the expected. Where the future is going, and sort of where CSU Global are trying to push all of our vendors that we're working with, is we treat Schoology, Schoology is our classroom, 100% online.
Yep.
So where we're trying to get our vendors to go to is, rather than having links like you mentioned, Kelly, it's great to have an assignment and then have the LTI link underneath. That way we can provide some instructions in Schoology. We can set some expectations for our students, and then we have that single sign-on experience where they can then go into that content platform. And that's sort of where we're seeing the future head, is that more seamless integration even further than what it already is.
Cool. And so you are presenting some of these concepts at Next in Chicago. What are some of the big highlights that we can expect there? Give us a little teaser, because I think you might get flooded from the people on this call.
All right. Well, I think the most interesting thing about LTI that very few people know is that when you click an LTI link, you're actually sending about 40 pieces of information from Schoology into that vendor's database. You're sending things like your first name, your last name, your email, the course name, the name of the link that you clicked on is all sent to that vendor. And so that's important to know for two reasons. One, you need to have that conversation with the vendor to understand whether they're keeping that data secure, whether that link is secure. And for the most part, it will be. People aren't setting these up on the fly. These are people that are thinking about setting up these integrations correctly. And then the other thing to think about is how you can leverage this kind of content. We're talking to a few different ebook vendors at the moment, and as far as we're concerned, if we name a link Chapter 3 and we're clicking on that link and we're sending that name over to the vendor, for all intents and purposes, there's no reason that vendor couldn't say, you're sending Chapter 3, we'll give you Chapter 3. And so that's sort of where we're understanding that, and being able to then have that conversation with the vendor makes that a great experience for our students if we can set that up ahead of time.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that I think that we often talk about with really a lot of instructional technology ideas, Jason, is where can we take out redundancies and just sort of labor work so that all of the cognitive processes are focused on actually the content and the learning, and not just how do I get into this thing.
For sure. No, that's really important for us. We have accelerated classes, and the average age of our learner is 34 years old. They have a family, they're sort of doing this on the side. So anything that adds complexity to their experience or anything that they have to do beyond simply jumping into the content is a pain. And so that's why we love LTI. Like you said, it's no passwords to remember, that they're straight in. For any of our paid LTI integrations, we have day one access, so we don't even make them log in. They just get access straight away and we take care of that billing piece for them. So it's so powerful that you can do so much with it and make it a great user experience. I think that's the biggest reason to use LTI, is that user experience.
That relationship to the content students are consuming, especially in a virtual world where there is no physical campus, right? There is no place to go. There's no library. That ability to funnel the content right to the learners without requiring any extra work for them just makes that learning experience so fluid and so directed. That seemed like such a big deal to CSU.
Yeah, and I liked how Jason also talked about the importance of like having a vendor who shouldn't be asking what LMS you're using, because it should be something that is a standard and that it should be available for everything. So
that's right. After we talked a little bit of longer and had a little Q&A back and forth, that is a point that he also drilled home based on some questions that were asked. There was a question asked this morning. Do you have a list of everyone who integrates with Schoology, of who support LTI? And if you go into the IMS Global site, they do have a list of everyone they've certified, right? Mm-hmm. But his point was, he had made a great point, don't start there. Look at the great content that's out there. Find the great content and the tools that your teaching staff is drawn to and that's really innovative, and then talk to them about LTI and about supporting Schoology if they're not doing it already. I was just at Kelly, I was at Delaware at Colonial School District, awesome school district, uses just Schoology all over the place. And there is a very cool OER vendor doing some very cool literacy stuff, but they were really new. They'd only been around a couple of years, but really innovative literacy app that had all of this really great material that was in the public domain and had some tools wrapped around it. And the first question everyone asked was, does it integrate with Schoology? And they hadn't done any integrations before. But that doesn't mean that you stop looking at them. That's when you talk to them and say, okay, well, you need to integrate with Schoology. And you know what? If they're not sure where to start, you just email us. We'll get them to the right people to help them along, because it is any content provider or educational tool provider are going to want to do this, whether they're working with Schoology or any other LMS, really.
Yeah.
And that's.
Sorry, we had a great question from Jennifer, actually, because I posted the link to the IMS Global site where they do have the products listed. She said, if you see one that you actually own and you want to utilize, but they're not part of the App Center, how do you get that content into Schoology? And I think that's part of the important vendor conversation, is that sometimes you have to initiate that conversation with the vendor, because they have to provide you with that secret, that client secret, and that client key, and that's what you enter in.
Exactly. And so to that point, let me just pop over to an admin screen again. That everything you see in the App Center, these are here simply because our team has had a conversation with their team, and we got everything we needed to put them into the App Center, right? These just represent the people we've had conversations with. It doesn't represent everybody, and it certainly doesn't represent all LTI apps that we work with. And that's why you also have this other area. If it's a app that they do say they support LTI, you should be able to go into this integration tab, into external tools, and add them as a tool provider and pop in this information to them. What I'd probably do is just send them this screenshot and say, this is what I need to enter into Schoology. And you can go ahead and do that and have that conversation with them, and then get them in touch with us later, and we can figure out how to add them to the App Store. But You know, sometimes those conversations take some time. There's no reason you can't go full steam ahead this way. Now, if you look in GoToWebinar, it's near the chat, the questions area in a window. There's a handout section. You should see a PDF there called the LTI guide. That's our guide. It's just about 4 pages or so that explains LTI, explains how the integrations work, and then most importantly explains what you need to know to have a conversation with a vendor. It's even a document you could just send to a content provider that you want to be working with. And it should give them everything they need to know to get started.
But don't you think, Bradley, that there's so many things that are happening in the LTI space right now? I think it's really important to like keep an eye on this area because the integrations are getting more and more complicated and complex and awesome. And so if you don't see something in the App Center now, that doesn't mean it's not available. It doesn't mean it won't add functionality. I think this area is going to really continue to grow and expand.
That's right, and you know, a few of you have asked very specific questions about, you know, does this app support grade passback? And you know, some apps may not support grade passback now. It doesn't mean that they won't in a couple of months.
Right.
So the idea is to talk to the vendors about getting that added, because LTI has a few different standards. You'll see them go through versions 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, etc. And those versions add new information to the standard that can be passed back between LMS and a content provider. So you may have had some content providers that got on the LTI bandwagon from the beginning, but because they started in the beginning, they may only do authentication. That doesn't mean that they can't keep adding to it and coming to the modern standard. And I think that was also Jason's point, is the importance of having those conversations, letting them know what your goals are, what the instructional goals are, so that they understand what to build into their apps, what to put on their roadmap.